Have you ever caught yourself doing something you swore you'd never do? A moment of cruelty, a lie that came too easily, a boundary crossed that you once thought unthinkable? We all like to believe we're good people. We imagine that if tested, we would stand firm in our values. But what if I told you that right now inside your brain, a silent transformation is already underway? The line between being a good person and becoming something monstrous isn't drawn by grand decisions or dramatic moments. It's being rewritten in your neural pathways with every small choice you make. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey into the darkest corners of human nature, not just through psychology, but through the physical changes happening in your brain as good people transform into monsters. And I'll reveal something these other videos haven't told you, the neurological key to why some people fall while others remain standing. By the end, you'll understand not just how good people become monsters, but the biological mechanisms that make it possible, and the surprising path back that science has only recently discovered. This isn't just about history's monsters or psychological experiments. This is about what's happening inside your brain right now. The transformation from good to evil never happens overnight. As Philip Zimbardo discovered in his Stanford prison experiment, it begins with small compromises, tiny ethical violations that seem insignificant at first. A harmless lie, a minor betrayal, a slight bending of personal values in the name of necessity. Consider the disturbing progression of Ted Bundy, one of America's most notorious serial killers. Before he murdered his first human victim, Bundy's descent began with torturing small animals as a child. In interviews, he described how he started with observing animals suffering, then progressed to causing it himself, experiencing a growing sense of power and control with each act. Each small transgression physically rewired his brain's reward circuitry, creating a neurological pathway where cruelty became associated with pleasure. This pattern isn't unique to Bundy. FBI research shows that nearly 70% of serial killers engaged in animal cruelty during childhood or adolescence. Jeffrey Dahmer impaled dogs' heads on sticks. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam killer, poisoned his mother's parakeet. Each act wasn't just a behavioral warning sign. It was physically reshaping their neural architecture, strengthening pathways between violence and reward while weakening connections to empathy centers. But here's what makes these small compromises so dangerous for all of us. Each one physically alters your brain. When you make a moral decision, you're not just making a choice, you're strengthening neural pathways. Each compromise makes the next one easier, not just psychologically, but neurologically. This is what psychologists call the slippery slope effect. What starts as a minor ethical lapse gradually erodes into something unrecognizable. The threshold for what's acceptable keeps expanding bit by bit until actions that once seemed unthinkable become routine. Think about the Watergate scandal. What started as a minor political scheme quickly escalated into a full-blown criminal conspiracy. Or consider corporate fraud cases like Enron, where small financial manipulations grew into massive deception. These weren't evil people who suddenly decided to become villains. They were ordinary individuals who made a series of small compromises, each one physically reshaping their brain's moral architecture until they couldn't recognize themselves anymore. The most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is, "I would never do that," because the truth is, no one believes they're capable of evil until it's too late. In the early 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most disturbing experiments in psychological history. Participants were instructed to administer what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person simply because an authority figure told them to. The results were shocking. 65% of participants continued delivering what they thought were dangerous shocks, even when they could hear screams of pain from the other room. But what Milgram couldn't see was what was happening inside their brains. Recent neuroscience research has revealed something fascinating. When we obey authority, our brain actually shifts activity away from regions involved in personal, moral decision-making. MRI studies show that following orders reduces activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for moral reasoning, while increasing activity in areas associated with procedural processing. In other words, obeying authority literally turns off the parts of your brain that make you morally responsible. This explains why so many atrocities throughout history have been committed by people who were just following orders. Nazi officers, soldiers in the My Lai massacre, and corporate employees following unethical directives. They weren't necessarily sadistic monsters. Their brains had physically adapted to surrender moral responsibility. What's truly terrifying is that this neural mechanism exists in all of us. It's not a flaw, it's a feature of human brain design that evolved to enable social cooperation. But in the wrong circumstances, this same mechanism can transform ordinary people into instruments of harm. The deadliest psychological trap isn't evil intent. It's the belief that obeying authority absolves you of personal accountability, and your brain is wired to fall into this trap. Humans are social creatures, wired to seek belonging. But this same instinct that builds communities can also turn deadly when it divides the world into us and them. In Henry Tajfel's minimal group experiments, researchers divided people into completely random teams, literally flipping a coin to assign them. The results were disturbing. Participants immediately favored their own arbitrary group and discriminated against others, even when there was no real difference between them. What's happening in the brain during this process? Neuroimaging studies reveal that when we view members of an outgroup, our medial prefrontal cortex, the region involved in social cognition, shows significantly reduced activity. Simultaneously, our amygdala, associated with fear and threat detection, becomes more active. This neural pattern is the biological foundation of dehumanization, seeing others as less than human. And once this switch flips in the brain, there is no moral boundary left to stop cruelty. Every major atrocity in history begins with this psychological shift. Nazis called Jews rats. In Rwanda, Hutus called Tutsis cockroaches. During slavery, African people were described as property rather than humans. The pattern is always the same. Before great atrocities occur, language is used to strip away humanity. Once a person becomes an object instead of a human being, harming them no longer triggers the neural circuits associated with empathy and moral restraint. What's most terrifying is that this neural process isn't limited to historical examples. It's happening right now on social media, in political discourse, and even in everyday conflicts. When we label entire groups as evil, stupid, or dangerous, we're not just using harsh words. We're physically altering our brain's ability to see their humanity. No one thinks of themselves as the villain. Even history's worst criminals believed they were acting for a greater purpose. This is the terrifying power of self-justification, the ability of the human mind to twist reality so that even the most immoral acts seem right. At the heart of this lies cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort we feel when our actions contradict our morals. Instead of admitting wrongdoing, the brain takes a different route. It rewrites reality. But this isn't just a psychological trick, it's a neurological process. When we experience cognitive dissonance, our brain shows increased activity in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the region associated with detecting conflicts. This creates an uncomfortable state that our brain is motivated to resolve. Here's where it gets interesting. Resolving this dissonance through self-justification activates the brain's reward pathways, releasing dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction. In other words, justifying our bad behavior literally feels good to our brain. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Each time we justify a moral compromise, we strengthen the neural pathways associated with that justification, while weakening connections to our original moral values. Over time, this physically reshapes our brain's moral architecture. This explains why corrupt politicians, war criminals, and everyday people rarely admit guilt. Their brains have literally rewired themselves to believe they are still in the right. The further someone goes down this road, the more distorted their morality becomes, not just psychologically, but neurologically. What makes all these psychological mechanisms so powerful is that they don't just change how we think, they physically change our brains. Every moral decision you make isn't just a choice, it's a physical event that strengthens certain neural pathways while weakening others. This is neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to reorganize itself through experience. When you repeatedly make small moral compromises, you're not just making decisions, you're physically carving pathways in your brain that make similar actions easier next time. The case of Edmund Kemper illustrates this neurological progression with chilling clarity. Before murdering 10 people, including his own mother, Kemper began by killing his grandparents' cats. In prison interviews, he described how the first killing was difficult, causing him physical nausea and emotional distress. But with each subsequent act, these reactions diminished. What he was describing, though he didn't know it, was the physical desensitization of his brain's empathy circuits. Neuroscientists now understand that repeated exposure to violence, whether committing it or witnessing it, causes measurable changes in the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex. The brain literally adapts to make violence easier to commit and easier to witness. This is why Kemper could progress from killing animals to killing humans with diminishing emotional resistance. His brain had physically adapted to make each step possible. Research shows that after just 3 weeks of exposure to morally outrageous content, participants showed measurable thinning in their anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for detecting moral conflicts. Their brains were literally becoming less capable of recognizing when they crossed moral lines. Stress hormones like cortisol, which are released during conflict, actually impair function in your hippocampus, the region responsible for contextual memory. This means that during intense situations, your brain physically loses access to memories that would normally remind you of your values and identity. Sleep deprivation, common during periods of high stress, further accelerates this process. Just one night of poor sleep reduces activity in your orbitofrontal cortex by up to 40%, severely impairing moral judgment while leaving emotional reactivity intact. This explains why moral corruption accelerates over time. It's not just psychological momentum, it's a physical transformation of your brain's architecture. While most discussions of moral corruption focus only on the descent, the neuroscience of recovery reveals something profound about human resilience. This transformation isn't a one-way street. The same neuroplasticity that allows your brain to be corrupted also allows it to heal and rebuild. When a neural pathway is activated, it temporarily becomes malleable before being stored again, a process called reconsolidation. This creates a window where even deeply entrenched moral pathways can be redirected. Consider the case of a former extremist whose online activities gradually pulled him into increasingly radical communities. After recognizing his transformation, he underwent a structured intervention that physically rebuilt his moral brain circuitry through 3 key elements. First, controlled exposure to contradictory perspectives, which activated his existing neural pathways while introducing conflicting information, creating what neuroscientists call prediction error, the brain's most powerful learning mechanism. Second, face-to-face interactions with people he had dehumanized, which reactivated his mirror neuron system and rebuilt empathic capacity. Third, deliberate practice of perspective-taking exercises, which strengthened connections between his prefrontal cortex and limbic system, restoring balance between rational and emotional processing. Brain scans taken before and after this intervention showed remarkable changes. Increased gray matter density in his anterior cingulate cortex, enhanced connectivity between his prefrontal cortex and amygdala, and restored activity in his ventromedial prefrontal cortex when making moral judgments. He hadn't just changed his mind, he had physically rebuilt his brain. What makes this particularly fascinating is that different types of moral corruption show different recovery rates based on which neural systems are involved. Corruption driven primarily by group identity shows faster recovery than corruption driven by chronic stress exposure, which causes more persistent changes to the hippocampus. This explains why some people seem to snap out of it quickly when removed from toxic environments, while others require more intensive intervention. So how do you protect yourself from this neurological transformation? And if you've already experienced it, how do you reverse the process? First, practice moral awareness. Before making decisions, pause and activate your prefrontal cortex by asking, would I still think this is acceptable if someone else did it? This simple act strengthens neural connections between your emotional and rational brain regions. Second, implement circuit breakers. Neuroscience shows that even brief cooling off periods dramatically increase activity in your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational decision-making. Set a rule to wait before responding to anything that triggers a strong emotional reaction. Third, engage in regular empathy exercises. Activities that activate your mirror neuron system, like reading literary fiction or engaging in deep face-to-face conversations, physically strengthen the neural networks that moral corruption weakens. Fourth, protect your sleep. Since sleep deprivation dramatically impairs moral functioning, getting adequate rest is protecting your moral brain. During deep sleep, your brain consolidates moral learning and repairs stress-induced damage to key regions. Fifth, practice intentional exposure to diverse perspectives. This doesn't mean subjecting yourself to toxic content, but rather thoughtfully engaging with reasoned viewpoints different from your own. This activates your anterior cingulate cortex, strengthening your brain's ability to detect moral nuance. For those already experiencing moral drift, more intensive interventions may be necessary. Periods of at least 3 weeks away from corrupting influences show significant restoration of interior cingulate cortex function. Meditation practices focused on compassion produce measurable increases in gray matter density in moral processing regions. The line between good and evil doesn't just run through every human heart, it runs through every human brain, and that line is being redrawn with every choice you make. The most dangerous belief isn't that you could never become a monster. It's that the process happens only in your mind rather than in the physical structure of your brain. Understanding the neuroscience behind moral transformation gives us something powerful: agency. The knowledge that our brains are being physically reshaped by our choices allows us to make conscious decisions about how we engage with the world. History has proven that the line between good and evil is thinner than we think. But science now shows us that this line isn't fixed. It's constantly being redrawn in the neural pathways of your brain. So I leave you with this question. Now that you understand how your brain is being physically transformed by your choices, what will you do differently tomorrow? Because the path to darkness isn't just paved with intentions, it's paved with neurons. And the path back begins with understanding that your moral self isn't just who you think you are, it's what your brain allows you to be. The choice isn't just psychological, it's neurological, and it's yours to make.